Hey everybody, Christina here with Sheridan Art and Designs to tell you all about our new series of videos. In this series, we're going to explore all the decisions you have to make to finish a cosplay project. And we want to help you identify those decision points and to make the best decision for your cosplay. The first decision point in every cosplay project is why. You need to know your why. Why are you making this project? Is it for a con? Is it for a competition? Is it just because you want to? Each of these things will influence the decisions you make throughout your project. For example, if I'm making a project for a con in Florida, I'm going to consider things like climate, crowd control, safety protocols, versus if I'm making a project for a competition, I'll consider things like elevating my construction or what our photo shoot is going to look like. Once you know your why, it becomes a guiding principle to help you make the decisions throughout your project. Once you know your why, you can determine what success means to you. Each project has its own definition of success, whether that's learning a new technique, trying out a new type of fabric, or winning a competition. What that looks like is totally up to you. So come along with us as we discover our why.
Thanks, Christina, for sharing with us the importance of knowing your why. Knowing why you want to make your cosplay or garment will help you with the next set of decisions. You don't have to make all of the decisions before you start. In fact, that could be really overwhelming and it might stifle your creativity. In fact, we like to break our decisions down into small sets, keeping the overarching theme or guiding principles of the project top of mind. So with that in mind, decision number one. Why are you making your project? You knew that was coming, right? For us, why are we making the Steampunk vest? This is an ensemble piece that is going to be used in a steampunk cosplay and likely worn at a Comic-Con when it's safe to return to attending those in person again. One of the guiding principles that we always keep in mind for us is always aim for competition ready. Now that we know our why, comes the next set of decisions. Are you ready? First up, what is your level of commitment to authenticity? Are you going for historically or character accurate? Or perhaps an homage or a nod to an era, like we did here, or a character? Is it a mashup or a gender bend? For us, we're doing a nod to the Victorian era, aiming for steampunk fantasy. Next, think about climate and comfort. Are you wearing this indoors or outdoors? Hot or cold, humid or dry? Are you gonna get all sweaty? How much are you going to need to move? Do you need to incorporate elements of functionality? Do you need to create secret pockets to keep all your essentials? Always create secret pockets to keep your essentials. And finally, what about design elements? Are there iconic character elements that you want to make sure you include? These are the questions I would think about at the design phase of the project because they will help inform me as to the fabrics and the materials that I might want to use. We are out of the design phase now and ready to choose our materials. Next set of decisions. First, material choices. Keeping the answers to the previous questions in mind, think about the look that you're going for. And what is your budget? Are there alternatives that might provide the same look but be more affordable? What is your color palette? Complements and contrast, not only in color, but also in texture, can help up-level your cosplay. And once you've picked your main fabrics, then think about the interlinings and linings and structure that you might need. Are you going to do full linings or just facings? Finally, what trims and notions might you need to complete the look? Small details can really make a cosplay or garment pop. So think about things like trims like piping or lace or beading. They can utterly transform a simple piece. Notions can be decorative as well as functional. So think about buttons like I did here. I used a decorative silver button. So buttons, zippers, and other types of fasteners. I always make sure to have a swatch of my fabrics with me when I select my trims and notions so I can audition them before I buy them to make sure that they're just right. Knowing these things up front also may tell me if I need to learn a new skill, or I need a new sewing tool, or a notion that might help me with this particular project. So let's take a look at the decisions I've made for the vest. So let's take a look at how I answered these questions for this project. This is going to be, again, used as a con piece, so thinking about keeping it competition ready, but also my model lives in Southern California, and so it's hot and dry, and oftentimes grueling temperatures over 100 degrees in the summertime and in the late fall, so that can be really sweaty, especially if you're choosing fabrics like I did with a leather. I wanted kind of a harder look, a little bit edgier look, but still kind of keeping with the more Victorian pieces. So I've chosen to do a couple of things. The first thing in the design, I didn't want to do just a straight Victorian vest, which would have been fine because then I might have been able to use it, cross it over with a different cosplay. But in speaking with my model, he wanted a asymmetrical design. So you can see here, and then probably a little bit better in this photo, is that we've chosen to make an asymmetrical front on it. And then the other thing that I wanted to do was that I wanted to break up, I had this fabulous brocade, it's a metallic brocade in my stash, and but it's a lot. As you can see, if you put a lot of yardage out of that, it can be a little bit busy and overwhelming. It's gorgeous, just for me, I wanted to use it sparingly. So I've complemented that with this pleather. It's got a really great back on it. It's almost like a double knit back, and it's got a soft brushed finish to it. So it lends itself very well to pairing with a really rich fabric like a brocade. Then came some decisions about the linings and interlinings. This brocade happens to be on the back. As I said, it's a metallic brocade, and the threads are very scratchy. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's very scratchy. So immediately I knew that I had to flatline the back of this brocade with something. But knowing that this is going to be worn in hotter climates and possibly indoors at a con, which could get hot and sweaty, I wanted to keep comfort for my model top of mind. So the flat lining I chose was a very sheer Pellin product. This is SK135. It's a white sheer. It's made for knits, but it actually worked really well just to give me a very light cover for all this metallic thread, and that'll do two things. One, it'll keep it from being scratchy and making all that rustling noise, and two, it will also protect the metallic threads and keep them from snagging and breaking, which is really common with these type of brocades. You have to be very careful with them. So then the next set of decisions was really about structure and lining, and with this pleather, it's a fairly thick, heavy fabric, and so immediately I knew that I didn't want to fully line the vest because it would be really hot and really sweaty. So thinking about comfort level for my model, I thought, okay, if I could do a polyester lining, but that doesn't really, it's plastic, right? Polyester is plastic, so it doesn't really lend itself to breathability. Looking for a fabric that has some natural breathability, I landed on silk. And again, I don't know as I would have gone with silk if I had to go out and purchase it, but I had some left over from the Night Circus cosplay that we just finished. And this lovely black silk taffeta, it sews like a dream. It's very breathable. It's already been tested in another project, and so I know how it's going to behave. So I opted to line, I'm going to use this silk taffeta for lining the front pieces, the two fronts, and the back. But the side front and side back of the vest, I'm actually going to leave unlined and just have the underside of the leather exposed, which I think is fine because it's got a beautiful backing to it, and I'll probably fell the seams or something, and it will look just fine. So those are the things that I've chosen to do that. Then I have I didn't, this asymmetrical piece on the left front, I wanted it to have some body, which this brocade is a good midweight fabric, but certainly needs something under it in order to provide some structure for that front lapel, because even though the buttons go all the way up and over to button it down fully, it could also be worn open as a flap coming over. If this top button or top two buttons are left open, it could be used as a roll flap. So it needs some structure. Again, going back to my stash, because let's use what we have, right? I ended up with a wonderful soft muslin. This is it's a good weight, but it's a medium weight, so it's still sheer, and it will provide the right amount of body and weight that I need for the front of the vest. I'm only going to use this as an interlining for the two front pieces of the vest to give it the structure it needs. My model you can see, is very muscular. He's got a very broad back and a narrow waist. So I don't need the structure in the back. His back is just, if I added any structure canvas pieces to that, it would look really odd on him. So interlining the two front pieces along with the flat lining. Could I choose not to flatline? Yes, of course. It really just depends on the effect that you're going for, and I found that combining the two, the Pellin and the muslin, was a really great option for me. So again, that was a decision point. I auditioned both of them together, looked at the drape, looked at the breathability and the comfort level, and chose to go with the combination of those two. You could also use a fusible, which would be just fine, and that would give you the structure that you need. I just tend not to like fusibles, especially in a piece that, it's just my personal preference, but I especially don't like it in pieces that I'm going to have to steam to shape, because they tend to delaminate fairly quickly. Also, if you're going to launder the piece over time, they will delaminate as well. So when I can, I choose to do a sew-in interlining, but that's just my personal preference. Some of the other things that I chose were I found these nice silver buttons, and those will go on to the brocade. Let's see if you can, yeah, see like that. So those will blend very nicely for the finish. So now that we've selected our materials, one of the next things I wanted to talk through with you was really about seams and seam finishing, because in the vest I'm using a variety of different seam finishes, and I'm making those decisions based on where the seam is, how is it going to be exposed, is it going to be inside of a lining, you know, is anybody going to see it, is it going to be hidden? Lots of different types of seams going on in the vest. So wanted to show you a few different types of seam finishes so that if you know what they are, and this is by no means all of the different types of seam finishings. I don't even go into any of the like hand finishings. There's lots of historically accurate hand stitching, hand finishings that you can do as well. Today we're going to focus mostly on what you can do with your machine and where you might use those seams and, you know, why. So that way, even if you're not making the vest that I'm making, you can decide which seam finish would be best for you and your cosplay. So the first one is this is just a raw, what we would call a raw or unfinished seam, and it is just two pieces of fabric stitched together, and this is, you can see the edge of the seam or the fabric is not finished and starting to unravel. So that's a raw unfinished seam. Lots of times where you would just use that. The next one is, this one might be a little bit easier for me to show you this way, is a pinked edge. And you just use this set of pinking shears and just trim those down. The pinking shears actually have a diagonal cut like that. And that's used primarily for a quick seam finish, but also invaluable if you have fabrics that unravel. And I can tell you, this brocade that I've been working with, I've pinked just about every edge of the fabric because if you look at it, it unravels. So using my pinking shears a lot. Helpful hint, if you are using a fabric like a metallic thread brocade, use a very old pair of pinking shears because they will dull your pinking shears very rapidly, and you can't sharpen pinking shears. So once they go bad, and you have to buy a new pair. So be careful with your fabric choices if you are, or your seam finishing choices. Actually, you can use any fabric, but with your seam finishing choices, with pinking and metallic threads. All right, then the next one up would be a zigzag or a serged seam. And this one, you can see I've just zigzagged the edge. This is to prevent fraying. So I've stitched my seam and then I've zigzagged the edge, the two edges together. And then, so in this case, I would press my seams to one side as opposed to open and flat like these other two. Then if you want to have an open flat seam but you want to have a nice finished edge, you can do an open finished, or sometimes this is called a clean finish seam. And so you would just normally stitch your seam as normal with your regular seam allowance, then you would press it open. Many people like to, you take the edge of the fabric like this and you just roll it under and then stitch it down. So you would roll it under like this and then stitch it down to get this finish. So many people don't like to press until they've done all of the stitching on the seams. I'm a presser. I like to press. I learned very early on that the iron is your friend and it will do a lot of the work for you and eliminate a lot of frustration. So when I'm doing a clean finish seam, and I actually used this one in the Tanjiro cosplay that we did last year, I will take it to the ironing board, and so if I've stitched my seam like this, I'll take it to the ironing board and I'll press it open, and then I'll actually fold it out like this so that I have the edge that I'm working on single, right? Everything else is behind it over here. And then I press. I just take my iron, the very tip of my iron, and I roll that over and give it a quick press. And then it stays in place when I go to my machine and stitch it down. I don't have to worry about trying to roll it and making sure that I'm catching that very narrow rolled hem. Now, if you have a hem foot on your machine and it does a rolled hem for you, that's very easy to do. You can just do that quick too, and you can eliminate the pressing step. A lot of people don't have that, so you would just roll, and again, I just press it under and then take it to my machine and zip, zip, zip. Okay, so then that's the clean finish. Then up from that, you kind of, let's see, you can get into some bound seams. This one happens to be a Hong Kong finish. For a Hong Kong finish, you would simply stitch your seam like you normally would, and then press it open, and then you would take a bias strip, and for a Hong Kong, you can do two things. You can use the same self fabric if you want, but I like to seize it as an opportunity to kind of posh things up a bit and use a contrasting or complementary fabric, just to give it a little element of elevation. So then you would take your bias strip and you would just lay it along the edge of the seam allowance here. So you pull everything back to the side, lay your bias strip along the edge, do a 1/4 inch, a scant 1/4 inch even, seam allowance, stitching the bias strip to the seam allowance edge, and then you simply roll that over. So on this example, I stitched it down and then I rolled it over the edge of the seam allowance, and then I came through and I did a stitch in the ditch, and I did this with black thread so you could see it, but I did a stitch in the ditch from my original seam of attaching the bias strip, and then give it a good press. So that's a Hong Kong seam allowance. You can also do this if you don't want to cut bias strips from fabric for this. It's a great way to use your cabbage up, by the way. You can also use packaged bias tape, works the same. The reason why you want it on the bias though is that because you are leaving this edge raw, you cut it on the bias, it won't unravel. Even if it's like this is a woven cotton, this would normally unravel very easily, but because I've got it cut on the bias, it won't unravel, and it goes around curves very nicely. So Hong Kong seam finish. The next one is one of my favorite seams that I use a lot, and I do use it in this vest, is the felled seam. There's lots of different ways to do a felled seam. This one is an example of machine stitching the felled seam. So essentially what you do is you take and you stitch your seam exactly the same, and then you would press it open and you take your scissors and you would cut one side seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. So you cut it down very narrow, just one side, making sure not to catch your self fabric in there. So everything's pressed aside, you have just your seam allowance, and you would cut that down to 1/8 of an inch. Then the next thing that you do once that's cut down, it would look like that. Then you simply press the longer seam allowance over to encompass that seam allowance and then roll it. So you're just going to roll it right under like that. Hard to do this when you're holding it, but you would roll it under. Again, the iron is your friend. Press, 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 and then you stitch it, your second line of stitching here. So this is my, this line here is my first line of stitching, right? So that's the seam. And then this line here is my second line of stitching, where I've wrapped the seam allowance around the one that I trimmed off, and now I've got a nice clean finished interior seam. You often see this, you see felled seams all over the place. You see them on jackets, on your blue jeans, they're very common in garment sewing. The other thing that you can do, if you don't want this line of top stitching to be visible, then you can hand fell this. So rather than machine stitch this second line of stitching, I would just simply do a whip stitch, and then it would not be visible on the outside. So two different ways to do a felled seam. And then the last one I'll show you is a French seam. French seams, I think, are scary for some people, simply because you start with them backwards. Instead of putting right sides together, like is the most common, you put right sides together, stitch, and then flip to the outside. With a French seam, you actually start with wrong sides together, and you do a very narrow 1/4 inch hem, scant 1/4 inch seam. And then what you're going to do is you're going to press that to one side and fold it, and then I give this a second press, because you want to bring that seam all the way up so it's very centered. So very clean and very centered, and you're not shifting the fabric one way or the other, right? So it's right on the edge there. And then you're going to go ahead and sew the rest of your seam allowance. So if you had a 5/8 seam allowance, we've taken up a 1/4, you're going to have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance that you would stitch here. If you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then you would just do another 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And then that ends up looking like this. And you can do two things. You can just simply press that French seam to one side, and you can choose to do a top stitching, much like the felled seam here, or you can just whip stitch these down, this seam down, if you don't want it floating up. Okay, and so the French seam, you can see, let me see if I can get you a good picture, get that close enough. You can see where the first seam that we stitched is right there in the interior, and then we've just simply wrapped around it. So there's no raw edges on the French seam. Now the French seam, if you need to make alterations, might not be a choice that you would use. You have to be very confident in your fit, and it's, it's just two seams that you have to rip out to make an alteration as opposed to one. All right, so those are our seam samples. Just wanted to quickly show you the decisions that I made in the vest. Continuing to make, actually. The vest is under construction. And we'll go this way so you can see. So, as I talked about, I used the silk taffeta for the back, and I did flat line the metallic with the pellin, and I've got the back all closed up so you can't see it at the moment, but so the brocade piece, this is just the center back piece, is lined with the silk taffeta. And then this is the faux leather right next to it for the side back and the side front pieces. And you can see that I have hand finished this edge where I've turned under the seam allowance and hand finished it down. And I stitched two right where the seam is, so I'm just covering the seam so none of that handwork shows on the outside. And this faux leather is actually very forgiving. It's a little bit thicker fabric so that you can pick up just the interior side of the pleather, the interior backing of it, and not go all the way through and have any stitches showing. So I'm very happy with how that's coming through. And so now I have these side seams, and I've stitched it. And now this is a synthetic, so I have to be very, very careful with pressing and ironing. It has to be a very low temperature iron because I don't want to melt this soft pleather finish. The other thing that I'm doing is I've got a terry cloth towel laid down over the top of my ironing board so that when I do press, it won't burn off the soft brushed finish that this particular fabric happens to have. And that's a good tip to learn for anything that's got a nap to it, like terry cloth or velvets, anything that has a plush finish like that. You can just lay a terry cloth towel, a nice thick plush terry cloth towel down, and use that as a pressing mat, and the fibers of the napped fabric will actually just embed nicely. It gives a place for those fibers to go without crushing it and making it go flat. So the next decision I have to make here on this side seam is really what am I going to do with it. I don't want to leave it unfinished, although I could, because this pleather does not unravel. I have no risk of that during wear, but I want to give it a really nice clean finish. And so I'm going to go back to my old standby. That felled seam is what I'm going to do. And so I'll be trimming this down, and I'm going to fell it to the back. So I'll trim down the side back seam allowance and then bring it this way with, and then I have a decision to make on the how I want to finish the felled seam. Now I can stitch it down and it will give me a top stitch line here, or I can fell it by hand, much like I did this seam with nothing showing there. And so that's one of the decisions I'll be making next. I likely will hand fell it, but we'll see. Getting a needle through 2 layers of the leather. We'll see how I feel about those challenges. Some of the other seam finishes I just want to show you quickly is, so this seam is the seam between the front and the side front that runs here. And I've left this open so that I can show you this. So I will, because I don't have to worry about this seam getting a lot of wear and tear, because I'm going to encase it in the lining, just like I did here on the back. Wanted to show you what that looks like. So I will trim and grade these down to eliminate a lot of the bulk. So I will start with the fabric closest to the side that I'm pressing towards, and that will be my shortest layer. Then I'll take up the brocade, and that will be a medium length, so slightly longer than the first seam allowance that I cut, and then the leather one will be left, and that will be grading the seam so it won't have this big excuse me, won't have a big, when I go to cover this and stitch this down, I won't have this big ledge and bulk, so you can actually see there's big bulk there, so it will eliminate that. So I'm going to grade this seam and finish it off just like I did this one here. Now that construction is finished, I thought I'd give you a peek inside what the finished piece looks like. So you can see I've got the silver buttons, those really blend in with this brocade, but I've got the silver filigree buttons there put on, and all the buttonholes made. And here's the vest back, and I've done a lot of handwork on the inside of this. So silk taffeta lining the full back, hand stitched down each side, and I hand stitched the bottom here. I did want to show you one of the things I did do was that I pleated the bottom, so hopefully you can see that there's just I created a pleat down here at the bottom. And what that does is that gives the lining a little bit of slack. You can see gives the lining a little bit of slack, but then I've pressed it neat so it doesn't extend beyond the bottom of the vest, but it does provide for movement, and so the lining doesn't get really taut and binding on the inside. So I've done that, and how you do that is really you just attach, you bring the bottom of your vest or waistcoat up about 1/4 to 1/2 inch above the hemline, and you stitch it down, and then you just press the pleat into it there, and so that gives you a little bit of slack there. It also prevents the bottom of the waistcoat from being pulled upwards. Sometimes you see coats or waistcoats or vests being they'll curl on the bottom, and that's because the lining is stitched down too tight, and this slack isn't put into the hemming. All right, so we finished the back. Moving on to the side pieces and the arm side. So I did a hand-bound arm side for the armholes here. So used a bias strip of the silk taffeta, same fabric, just cut a bias strip and stitched it down to the pleather. The top, as you can see, the top, front, and back of the arm side are fully lined with the silk taffeta, as those are the top pieces of the front and back. But the bottom, the side pieces, I made out of the pleather, and they were not lined, so I had to finish off the bottom of the arm side. So I just did that with this bias binding strip, stitched it on, turned it to the inside, and I did do an understitching. I don't know if I can get to see that. It's right here. I understitched this edge so that the bias strip would naturally curl to the inside, and you would not see that bias strip on the outside at all. All you see is the turned pleather. And then I hand finished the bottom edge off of that. Now normally I would only do this 1/4 of an inch wide, but because the pleather has zero stretch to it, I needed to make this a little wider to accommodate the curve around the arm side without any kind of pulling or tugging. So that's why I made it a little bit wider than I normally would, almost twice as wide as I normally would. Then coming down to the side seam, as I talked about earlier, I graded the seam and then did a flat felled seam, and I opted to hand finish this one because I didn't want any top stitching on the outside here. I just wanted the beauty of this textured pleather for a very clean look. And that's it. I did the same thing on this side, so you can see arm side. I did place a button here on the inside, and that is for to secure the right front here. So you can see there's a buttonhole here. This one comes over and buttons, and then we do the external buttons down this way. My model opted for a single welt pocket, and so I decided to trim that in the pleather just to kind of tie it all off. He did not want 2 pockets on both sides, a pocket on each side, just wanted the one single welt pocket for his watch. And that's it. So I think we've accomplished all of the decisions that we had to make early on at the onset of this project, and really pleased with how it turned out.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and keep creating.
Hey everyone, remember to like and subscribe below.